On a Thursday morning in late October, a 1963 Steinway Model D concert grand sat in the corner of a Winnipeg estate auction house with a handwritten tag wired to one of its legs. The number on the tag was $300. The lid was warped. 3 keys in the upper register produced no sound at all. The lacquer had bubbled and split along the entire length of the fallboard, and someone, at some point in the preceding decades, had attempted to refinish the legs with a brush in the wrong color, leaving streaks of dark walnut stain over what had originally been ebonized black. 41 buyers moved through the space that morning. Most of them paused at the Steinway long enough to press 1 or 2 keys, hear the dead ones, and move on. A piano technician from St. Boniface named Roland checked the soundboard with a flashlight, shook his head, and wrote something in the margin of his catalog before walking to the back of the room where a mid-century credenza was drawing more serious interest. Only one man did not walk away. He was 47 years old, wearing a canvas work jacket and boots that still carried dried mud from a job site he had left at 6 that morning. He stood in front of the Steinway for a long time, not pressing keys, not opening the lid, just looking at it. He stood there for what the woman at the registration desk later described as nearly 4 minutes, which was long enough to become noticeable in a room where most people spent 4 seconds. Then he raised his bidder card. His name was Cal Bernier. He ran a 2-man furniture restoration shop on Selkirk Avenue in the north end of Winnipeg, a long, narrow space behind a former hardware store that smelled of linseed oil and shellac and the particular dry warmth of wood that had been worked and reworked over many years. He had been awake since 4 in the morning, not from anxiety but from the habit of early rising that had followed him since his 20s. When he had worked summers at his uncle's workshop in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and learned that the best hours for careful work were the ones before anyone else arrived. His daughter Margot, who was 9 years old and had her mother's habit of asking questions that cut directly to the thing, had watched him from the kitchen doorway at 4:30 as he sat at the table with the estate auction catalog open on his tablet. She had asked what he was looking for. He told her he was not sure yet. She had accepted this with the ease of a child accustomed to answers that took time to complete themselves, poured herself a glass of water, and gone back to bed. Cal had found the listing at 2 in the morning, a single photograph taken from the wrong angle under fluorescent lighting that made the piano look smaller than it was, and worse than it probably deserved. The catalog description was brief and dismissive: upright grand piano, damaged, sold as is, no tuning history available, condition poor. But the catalog had said upright, and the photograph, poor as it was, showed an instrument that was clearly not upright. It was a full concert grand, 9 feet in length, the curve of the rim visible even in a compressed image taken from the wrong end of the instrument. He had looked at that curve for a long time. His mother had played piano for 31 years, first in the living room of the house on Daraball Street in Montreal where he had grown up, and later, after she moved to a smaller apartment in Verdun, on a Yamaha upright that she never fully loved but made the best of. She had taught Cal to listen for the resonance of a piano before any other consideration. She had told him once that a great piano announces itself in the decay of a note, not the attack. That the way sound dies in a good instrument is more truthful than the way it begins. Cal did not play piano, but he had spent 30 years listening the way his mother taught him, and the curve of that rim in a low-resolution photograph at 2 in the morning was enough to bring him fully awake. He paid $300 in cash. He signed the transfer papers at a folding table near the entrance while the auctioneer moved on to a set of bedroom furniture that drew 3 competing bids. The woman at the registration desk looked at his work jacket and then at the piano on its rolling dolly, and said nothing, except to confirm that he would need to arrange his own transport. Cal told her he had a truck. He and his partner Dennis loaded it onto a flatbed with moving blankets and rope ties at 11 in the morning. Dennis keeping up a steady, quiet commentary about the condition of the lacquer and the warped lid and the amount of space the thing was going to occupy in a shop that was already operating at capacity. Cal drove back to Selkirk Avenue with both hands on the wheel and let Dennis talk. He had known Dennis for 18 years. Dennis said what he thought and then he helped anyway, which was the only kind of honesty Cal had ever had much use for. The shop had north-facing skylights that Cal had argued for when he signed the lease 12 years ago, specifically because north light was consistent. It did not shift with the angle of the sun or produce the warm flattery of afternoon yellow. It showed surfaces the way they actually were. He pushed the piano to the center of the floor on a furniture dolly and positioned it under the main skylight. And then he did something Dennis found difficult to explain afterward when he described it to his wife. Cal sat down on a low stool 6 feet from the instrument, put his hands in his lap, and looked at it for a very long time without touching anything. Dennis stood near the workbench with his coffee and waited, because he had seen this before, not with pianos, but with armoires and sideboards and the occasional piece of furniture that arrived looking like nothing and left the shop having become something recognizable again. Cal's silences were not the silences of a man who did not know what to do next. They were something else. A kind of systematic looking that Dennis had never learned and no longer tried to. Margot arrived after school with her backpack and settled herself at the small desk Cal had set up for her in the corner near the radiator. She opened her homework without being asked, and the shop was quiet except for the low sound of traffic on Selkirk and the scratch of her pencil on the page. Then Cal stood up, put on cotton gloves, and began. What he found over the next 6 hours contradicted every assumption the auction house catalog had carried. The first thing he examined was the plate, the cast iron harp that ran the full length of the instrument's interior and bore the tension of the strings. The lacquer on the exterior was damaged beyond recovery, but the plate itself, once he had opened the lid fully and positioned a work lamp above it, was intact, free of cracks, properly seated at every point along its contact surface with the rim. He spent 20 minutes on the plate alone, running his gloved finger along the edges, checking the string pin block for splitting. There was none. The pin block was solid. He took 3 measurements and recorded them in his notebook without expression. Dennis, watching from the side, noticed that Cal wrote the numbers down more carefully than usual. The second thing he examined was the rim. The outer rim of a concert grand is bent under heat and pressure from a single continuous strip of maple, layered and laminated to a specific curve, and the quality of that bending and the quality of that maple determine the acoustic properties of the instrument more than almost any other single factor. Cal removed the outer casing panels on the bass side with a Robertson screwdriver and a thin pry bar and looked at the rim directly for the first time. The maple was old and dry and extraordinarily clean. Not a single separation. Not a single separation. Not a crack. Not a point of stress failure anywhere along 88 inches of continuous curve. He measured the rim thickness at 4 points and got consistent numbers each time. He wrote those down too. Then he sat back on his stool and was quiet for a moment, in a way that Dennis recognized as different from his usual quietness, and Dennis put down his coffee. The third thing Cal did was find the serial number. It was stamped on the plate in a location Steinway had used since the late 19th century, and it was partially obscured by decades of interior dust and the residue of a previous amateur cleaning attempt involving what appeared to have been the wrong kind of solvent. Cal used a soft, natural bristle brush and worked slowly in a small area, clearing one character at a time. It took him 40 minutes. When he stepped back and looked at the number he had uncovered, he did not say anything for a moment. He took a photograph. Then he opened his laptop on the workbench and typed the number into the Steinway production database, a resource maintained by the manufacturer that cross-referenced serial numbers with production year, model designation, and original point of sale. The number resolved immediately. The instrument had been manufactured in 1927 at the Steinway factory in New York. It was a Model D, the largest concert grand in the Steinway catalog, 9 feet in length. The instrument used as standard on the stages of Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall, and every major concert venue in the world for most of the 20th century. It had been sold new in 1928 to a concert society in Montreal. After that, the production record went quiet, the way things went quiet when they moved through private hands over long enough periods of time. But the number was clear, and the instrument in front of him was not damaged in any way that mattered. The lacquer was gone. 3 keys needed new hammer mechanisms. The strings required full replacement. The soundboard, which he had been most concerned about, showed a single crack near the treble bridge that was old and stable. The kind of crack a good technician could address without touching the acoustic properties of the board itself. The thing that made a Model D, its geometry, its rim, its plate, its fundamental structure, was entirely present, entirely intact, entirely recoverable. Cale called his mother that evening from the shop. She was 73 and living in the Verdun apartment with her Yamaha, and her books and the photograph of Cal's father on the shelf above the piano. She picked up on the second ring. Cal told her what he had found. There was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough that he checked the screen to confirm the call had not dropped. Then she said, very quietly, that she needed him to say the year again. He said, 1927. She said in French something that did not translate directly but meant approximately, that some things were too old and too good to disappear. Cal did not sleep much that night. He sat at the kitchen table after Margot had gone to bed and worked through what he knew against what he still needed to confirm. He had the serial number. He had the physical evidence of the rim and the plate and the pin block. He had the production database entry. What he did not yet have was documentation of the instrument's acoustic history, the record of how it had sounded and been maintained through the decades of its life before it arrived in a Winnipeg estate auction, with a $300 tag and a catalog description written by someone who had not looked closely enough to know the difference between an upright and a concert grand. He called René Chartrand the next morning. René was 66 years old, a retired piano technician who had worked for 38 years as the head technician for the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, and before that, for a decade at McGill University's music faculty. She and Cal had known each other for 11 years, since the time she had brought him a 19th-century French writing desk with a damaged veneer, and he had returned it to her in a condition she described afterward as better than new, which was technically not possible, but captured the quality of the result. She arrived at the shop at 2 in the afternoon with a tuning lever and a set of voicing tools and a small bag of reference materials she had not mentioned bringing. She looked at the piano for a long time from the doorway before entering. Cal watched her face and said nothing. Dennis had gone to a delivery. Margot was at school. The shop was quiet. René worked for 3 hours. She did not speak during this time except to ask Cal to hold a lamp at specific angles, which he did. She opened the instrument fully and examined the soundboard under magnification, and then put the magnifying glass away and pressed both palms flat against the board and closed her eyes for a moment. She tested the tension of 6 strings in different registers with a calibrated gauge she carried in a leather sleeve. She tested the action of the keys that did respond, finding them heavy but functional. The hammers worn but not destroyed. She examined the tuning pen block through a tool scope and confirmed what Cal had measured. Solid, no separation, no lifting. Then she sat down on the piano bench, which had not come with the instrument and was slightly the wrong height, and played a single note in the low bass register, an A 2 octaves below middle C, and let it decay in full silence. And they both listened to it die. The note lasted longer than it should have. Not longer than a functioning piano. Longer than a damaged one. The sustain was 31 seconds, which René timed without making a point of it. And when it was gone, she sat with her hands in her lap for a moment before turning to look at Cal. She told him the soundboard crack was cosmetic in its acoustic effect. She told him the rim was the finest example of original Steinway bent maple she had encountered outside a museum collection. She told him that if the strings were replaced by a competent technician, and the action rebuilt, and the hammers revoiced, the instrument would perform at a level consistent with its original specification. She then told him, in a tone that had gone slightly careful, that original 1927 Model D instruments in recoverable condition were not a common thing in the world, and that he should understand what he was holding. Cal asked her what she meant by uncommon. She said there were fewer than 40 verified examples of pre-war Model D instruments in restorable condition currently known to the major piano auction houses. She said the last one to reach open auction in Canada had sold for $480,000 4 years ago, and it had been in worse structural condition than this one. Cal thanked her and walked her to the door and stood in the cold of the Selkirk Avenue sidewalk for a moment after she left, looking at nothing in particular, before going back inside and locking up for the night. The complications arrived on the 5th day in the form of a phone call from a man named Philip Drummond, who identified himself as the executor of the estate from which the piano had been consigned to auction. Drummond's voice had the measured tone of someone who had been advised by counsel before dialing. And the substance of his call was that the estate had recently become aware that the consigned item may have been significantly undervalued at the time of sale, and that there were questions the estate wished to raise regarding the adequacy of the auction house's appraisal process. He did not say the word fraud. He did not need to. Cal listened to the full statement, said he would look into the matter, and ended the call. He put the phone on the workbench and returned to cleaning the interior of the pin block cavity with a soft cloth. Dennis, who had been in earshot, asked if they needed a lawyer. Cal said the bill of sale was valid and the terms were standard and that the instrument was going to do its own talking when the time came. Dennis said that was either very calm or very naive. Cal said he was aware of the distinction. On the seventh day, he called Renee Chartrand again and asked her the name of the most serious institutional buyer she knew for a pre-war Steinway concert grand in restoration-ready condition. She gave him 3 names. He asked about the third, a music conservatory in Halifax that had been operating for 81 years and had recently completed a capital campaign specifically to acquire a concert-grade instrument for their recital hall. He asked whether students had access to the instrument for practice and performance. Renee confirmed they did, that the conservatory ran public concerts twice monthly and offered student performance opportunities to enrollment stream musicians at the secondary level. Cal said to put him in touch. The conservatory's acquisitions director called back within 4 hours. Her name was Sylvie, and she spoke with the clipped precision of someone who spent most of her professional life making careful decisions with limited funds, and was accustomed to being disappointed by what the market offered. Cal sent her Renee's written assessment, his own documentation of the serial number and production record, and 39 photographs taken under north light from every relevant angle. There was a silence of 2 days during which Cal continued working on an unrelated commission, a pair of Victorian side tables with damaged veneer, and did not contact the conservatory again. Sylvie called on the second afternoon and told him the conservatory's board had reviewed the documentation and wanted to arrange a visit. Cal said the instrument was not yet in concert condition. She said she understood and that they wanted to see it as it was. He said they were welcome to come. She arrived the following Tuesday with the conservatory's piano technician, a careful man in his 50s named Bertrand, who had trained in Lyon and worked for 20 years in Toronto before moving to Halifax. Bertrand brought his own tools and spent 2 hours with the instrument while Sylvie sat on a chair near the wall and watched. Margot was at the desk in the corner doing her reading homework. She looked up at the visitors once, assessed them with the uncomplicated directness of a 9-year-old, and returned to her book. Bertrand asked Cal to hold a lamp in 4 separate positions and to confirm 2 measurements with a steel rule, which Cal did. When Bertrand finished, he packed his tools and spoke to Sylvie in a low voice for 3 minutes. Then Sylvie turned to Cal and asked him what he wanted for it. Cal told her he had not yet named a number. She asked him what he considered a fair basis for the conversation. He said he had paid $300, spent 14 days in documentation and assessment and initial cleaning, and that he believed the instrument, fully restored by a qualified technician, would be worth between $400,000 and $600,000 on the open market. He said he was not interested in the open market. He said he was interested in the instrument being played in a room where people came specifically to listen to it, and by students who were learning what it sounded like to play a great instrument correctly. Sylvie looked at him for a moment. She asked what he was asking. He said $225,000, including a full restoration to be completed by Renee Chartrand. Sylvie told him the conservatory's budget for the acquisition had been set at $200,000. Cal said $200,000 was acceptable if the restoration was included in the agreement and if the information panel beside the instrument in the recital hall carried the name of the craftsman at the Steinway factory in New York who had built the original action. He had found the craftsman's mark inside the instrument during cleaning, an initial and a date stamped in pencil on the underside of the keyframe in the manner that several Steinway craftsmen had used in the late 1920s. It was not a famous name. Cal did not know whose name it was, but it was there, and someone had put it there in 1927, and he thought it should be read. Sylvie said, of course. She extended her hand, and Cal shook it. Bertrand nodded once. Margot, who had been watching from her desk, went back to her book without comment. The transfer agreement was signed on the 15th day. Renee Chartrand would complete the restoration over 4 months, working in her studio in St. Boniface, after which the instrument would be transported under full insurance to Halifax. Cal drove the documentation to his bank on Portage Avenue on a Wednesday morning and sat in his truck in the parking lot for a while before going inside. He was not a person who spent much time thinking about money in the particular way that people thought about money when an unexpected amount of it arrived. He thought instead about what he was going to do with what he had, and about his daughter, and about the scholarship fund he had been meaning to establish at the community music school on McGregor Street for 2 years, and had not yet done because the shop's margins had not made it easy. He thought about his mother's Yamaha in the Verdun apartment and about the phone call he needed to make. He thought about a woman named Carla, who had been his wife for 6 years and had died 4 years ago in April, and had never known that he was going to be the kind of person who found something no one else stopped to look at and knew what it was. He called his mother from the truck before going into the bank. She picked up on the first ring, which was unusual. He told her it was confirmed and that the number was $200,000. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said his father would have enjoyed hearing that. Cal said he thought so too. She asked about Margot. He said she was fine, that she had done her homework every evening in the corner of the shop without being reminded and had shown no particular interest in the piano beyond asking once, on the third day, whether it was sad. Cal had told her it had been waiting to be heard properly. Margot had considered this and then gone back to her reading. His mother said that sounded like something Margot would do, and that it also sounded true. Dennis came to the shop the morning after the agreement was signed. He stood near the piano, which still looked the way it had when they brought it in. Lacquer bubbled and split. 3 dead keys. The wrong color stain on the legs. He looked at it for a while and then he said Mason. Which was wrong, he said Cal, and asked if he ever thought about what would have happened if he hadn't been awake at 2 in the morning looking at a catalog. Cal said no. He said that kind of question didn't have a useful answer. Dennis said he supposed that was right. They had coffee and went to work. The estate's legal inquiry dissolved on the 16th day when the auction house's own records confirmed that the instrument had been catalogued as an upright, assessed by a third-party appraiser who had never physically entered the estate property and had based his evaluation on the single photograph, and sold under terms that explicitly released the house from liability for misidentification of consigned goods. Philip Drummond called once more, this time briefly, and the call had the quality of a door closing rather than a conversation. Cal listened, said he understood, and returned to the Victorian side tables which were due for delivery by Friday. Renée Chartrand completed the restoration 7 weeks ahead of the schedule she had set for herself, in the particular way that people who love their work sometimes finish early without intending to. She called Cal the morning she put the last hammer back in the action and played the full range of the keyboard without stopping. She played it for 8 minutes, she told him afterward, and it had not wanted to stop. She said that was not a technical observation. Cal said he knew what she meant. The conservatory held a reception on the evening the piano arrived in the recital hall in Halifax. Cal did not attend. He had been invited, but the drive from Winnipeg was 33 hours and Margot had school in the morning, and he had 3 commissions waiting in the shop. He watched a 2-minute video Sylvie sent to his phone of Bertrand playing the opening of a Schubert sonata on the restored instrument in the empty recital hall, the sound carrying easily in a space built for exactly this purpose. Cal watched it twice in the kitchen after Margot had gone to bed. He thought about the note his mother had described, the way a great piano announces itself in the dying of a sound rather than its beginning. He could not fully hear it through a phone speaker, but he thought it was probably there. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The information panel beside the Steinway in the recital hall at the Halifax Conservatory carries 3 lines: the manufacture date, the model designation, and below those, in the same typeface, crafted at Steinway & Sons, New York, 1927. W.H. Craftsman's Mark. Keyframe. Cal did not know who W.H. Craftsman's Mark. Keyframe. Cal did not know who W.H. was. He did not know anything about him except that he had been careful enough, in 1927, in a factory in New York, to leave a mark inside an instrument that no one outside the factory was ever meant to see. Not for recognition, not for credit, simply because he had been there, and because the work had been his. In the shop on Selkirk Avenue, the space where the piano had stood was occupied within a week by an oak dining table, needing a full strip and refinish. Dennis pointed out that the shop immediately felt its normal size again. Cal said that was probably right. Margot came after school and did her homework at the corner desk, and at some point in the early evening looked up at the space where the piano had been, and then back at her notebook without saying anything. Cal turned off the skylights at 7 and locked the front door and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the November cold before driving home. The sky over Selkirk Avenue was clear and very dark the way it gets in Winnipeg by mid-November, when the last of the autumn warmth is finished, and the cold that settles in is the real kind. The kind that stays. He thought about 41 buyers moving through a room on a Thursday morning in October, and about a piano that had been sitting in a Winnipeg estate auction with a $300 tag, and about the 4 minutes he had spent standing in front of it while everyone else moved on. He had not known in those 4 minutes exactly what it was. He had known only that it was worth 4 minutes, and that 4 minutes was more than anyone else in the room had decided to give it. That was not luck. That was not expertise exactly. It was something quieter and harder to name. The habit of slowing down in front of a thing that asked to be looked at, even when it had given no one any particular reason to stop. 41 people were in that room. All of them had seen the piano. Not one of them had listened to it.